Hi, my name is Dr. Greg Bliss, and we're going to be spending the next 20 minutes or so together. The scripture verses that you read at the beginning of this teaching series addressed a subject of adoption and discipline. Now, it might not look that way when you read the texts themselves, but underlying the foundation of the biblical texts, you have this concept of the adoption that is given to us as sons and daughters of God, and the discipline that is part of that process. And so we're going to explore that today, and we're going to start off with the 23rd Psalm, which probably everyone is familiar with, but a particular passage of that, and I want to reflect on that in my own life, and especially as a young person, how that affected me. So you've read the 21st Psalm, the 23rd Psalm. This line is particularly graphic if you understand the topography of the Middle East, and if you understand kind of like what shepherds do and how sheep respond to shepherds. People have written about this subject often. I'm reading from verse 4 of the 23rd Psalm. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For your rod and staff, they comfort me. And there may be different translations of that in terms of the ordering of the words, but essentially you have this frame of reference of the Middle Eastern shepherd. And the sheep are overseen by the shepherd, and his rod and staff has a function in his shepherding. Well, what is that function? What are we talking about here? What does this mean? Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. Now, in the psalm, we're basically shown to be sheep, and in the 10th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus develops this metaphor, declaring himself to be the good shepherd, and we are his sheep, the sheep of his pasture. But in this context, in specific context, we have David reflecting upon his years as being a shepherd, which we know of from the historical books, and we know of David's early life as a shepherd. That process of being a shepherd has not changed much in 3,000 years. It's essentially the same as it was 3,000 years ago. The topography, the landscape in Israel, is got a lot of hillsides, right? There are a lot of terraced hillsides which people plant on. And especially in the hills of Judea, near Bethlehem. And that area, you have these valleys, and they're not valleys the way we perceive them here in the United States. They're small areas, wadis, sometimes they're called, out in the desert, where water will run through the bottom of the valley, but you're only talking maybe 300 or 400 feet to the top of the hill. But there are terraced slopes going down to that. Sometimes those wadis are very steep, and oftentimes they're treacherous and dangerous. These are the areas where sheep will go out to pasture. It's not these flat green pastures, although they exist, but it's in this treacherous terrain. So it's in that context that his rod and staff comforts the sheep. Okay? Now there's a kind of a reverse anthropomorphism going on here. We're making sheep into kind of human beings, but the point being is that what is that rod and staff? What does that mean? And that's what we're trying to unpack here. Well, the rod in the Hebrew language and in the usage of the text is similar in construct to a scepter, which a king would hold. And the idea here in the Hebrew has to do with the rule over a clan. It is the signet ring, if you will. It is the ruling rod that basically declares your headship over a clan. So when one would hold that rod, they would be the head of the clan. And they would have the right to discipline within that clan. It was also a way that shepherds would count their sheep when they would bring them in. They would touch them with the top of the rod, and they would count them as they were brought in, so they didn't have to extend their hands down and deal with that, and lightly touch the sheep as they would come back into the sheepfold. They would count the sheep and lightly touch them with the rod. And there's the staff. Now the staff is a walking stick. Maybe you've seen those before, where hikers will sometimes use them. And in the precarious topography of the Middle East, in the Judean foothills, having a walking stick is very important because it gives you a third point of balance. So it allows you to balance yourself. How then would we apply this to say that thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Walking through the valley of the shadow of death would refer to, as an analogy, when we're dealing with death itself, but it also is dealing with the idea of a valley where there's a huge shadow, which means there's steep walls. And you could fall off and die, and it would be a valley of death, right? You would fall off the narrow path. And so there's something here about that staff that Jesus is using, if we continue the metaphor, that he is using the staff, he is representing the staff, the example of how we walk on the earth. He gives us a perfect example of how to walk on the earth. And then the rod, which shows his ownership over us and lightly touches us to count us to be his own. Now, that rod was also used to defend against those who would attack. So that's why the rod and the staff comforts the sheep when they're in that position of being on this narrow trail in the valley of the shadow of death. Thy rod and thy staff comfort me. I know that I am the Lord's and that he is mine, as the Song of Solomon says. And as Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice, and I call them out by name. So that's the framework of Psalm 23. And it gives us this intimacy between the shepherd and the sheep that we can find in the text that we're going to be investigating in John, the 5th chapter.